Hello, I'm Chris Flischer, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flischer, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flischer. This is a show about astrology primarily. Oftentimes I wander off the path of Western astrology to discover different modalities, but that's all part of the journey, I find. I've got a great guest coming on in a few minutes. We're going to be talking about Vedic astrology, which many of you probably don't know, or some of you do know, but I've had many guests on, and we've discussed Vedic astrology in the past, and it's a fascinating subject to me because it's all working with the same process, underlying foundation of the universe and the stars. So that's going to be interesting. Before we get started, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which is becoming very popular, I have to say. My numbers are jumping up very high. I'm not sure why, but I'm very happy to see that. And it comes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology, as well as a breakout of the individual signs beyond that. And then also there's links to my podcasts in there, links to my television shows, and artwork as well. So all this stuff is in there in the newsletter, and it's free if you can sign up for it. It's free for now. I'm not saying it's going to be free forever, but at least for now, it's free. So if I were you, I would get on while you can before the switch gets turned the other way, perhaps potentially in the near future, and we decide to do something a little bit different. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway. That's just a rumor now, so don't get carried away with it. Anyway, my guest today is Pamela McDonough. She is a Vedic astrologer. She's just written a book called The Beginner's Guide to Vedic Astrology. Her website is moondanceastrology.com. Moondance Astrology is one long string of characters, moondanceastrology.com. And she's here today to discuss her new book called The Introduction to Vedic Astrology. So welcome to the show today, Pamela. It's great to have you on.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm delighted to be here. I've been a big fan of your show for a long time.
Oh,
you
really?
may not know, but I started
That's
out in Western astrology, so I have some knowledge of both systems. So, and again, it's my honor. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have you on. I'm glad to hear that you've been listening to the show. That's encouraging. So it's interesting. If you've got your background in Western astrology, what sort of led you to the Vedic format?
Great question. Let's see where to start. I have a long answer. I don't know. Do you want the long version? Or
Sure,
the
the long answer is
Chris?
fine. Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, because most people who start out as Western astrologers are fascinated by astrology. They stick with it. And, I'm just wondering what made you change, or do you work with both modalities?
Great question. Okay, so let me answer the first question first. And so, I started out in Western astrology in the 90s. I was actually working as a vendor in the corporate world, and in the cosmetic industry, actually. And I had an assistant buyer who was really into Western astrology. And so we had a lot of great conversations offline, during our off time about it. And I started studying it intently. And, oh, boy, I guess it was about probably under 10 years later where I was in a transition period from my corporate role at the time. Our company got bought out, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I kind of wanted to change. I wanted to change industries and do something different, and nothing was really coming up right for me. So I just decided I was going to get a job, not for money, but to just do something that I was passionate about. So I looked in our alternative paper, and there was a administrative assistant role, if you could call it that, for a very well-known Vedic astrologer in Seattle. Huh. And I'm like, well, I'm interested in astrology, but I have no idea what Vedic astrology is. And I went and applied for the job and took the job, and I wasn't there for very long because circumstances required me to go back to my corporate, career path a few months later. But it was enough to get me hooked. I was just fascinated by it, and I kept fighting it, Chris. I was like, I don't want to learn a new system because I'm still trying to get a really good handle on this Western astrology.
I know they're
stuff.
both very complex. I think about the way I feel about astrology is that you never really know it all, but you study it all your life, and it just sort of becomes the language that consumes you. And I don't think to be an astrologer you have to know everything there is to know. I think it's good to have avenues of discovery that are more important than others. I think it's good to have specialty in astrology, or it's just good to have a very good, thorough understanding of it. But I think it's a very complex art and science. I think it's both. And in your case, learning because the Vedic astrology, I've always been fascinated by it, but the language has always scared me off. The terms scared me off. It wasn't familiar to me, so I can imagine what you had to be wrestling with the same sort of thoughts.
Yeah, it was interesting, and I really appreciate you saying that we don't have to know everything because, as you say, it's all-consuming, and for the personality type, I think, that studies any astrological system, you kind of have to be a little OCD.
Yeah, I think so.
Right?
Yeah, well, you're very, you're just drawn into this language. It's such a fascinating language and tool that once you get hooked by it, it's very difficult to walk away from it. I'm consumed by it myself.
Yep, totally. Me too. Even 20, almost 20 years later,
oh, yeah,
totally
easily.
consumed.
Yeah, I've never stopped.
Yeah,
ever since
totally
I first got
consumed.
bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
But for me, what was so interesting is I had already been on the path of yoga. I had been studying Ayurveda and, done quite a bit of self-inquiry with regard to Ayurveda and yoga.
Yeah.
And this just fit. It was another piece of the puzzle, and they all went together. The whole concept of Ayurveda and the Ayurvedic medicine in India and how it goes hand in hand.
Right.
Yeah, all of it. I'm like, wow, this is it, and for me, I don't know, it almost, I've said this before, it was like coming home for me.
Interesting.
It just felt familiar, which is strange because I at the time I'd never been to India. I have since, but it was so foreign to me, but yet so familiar. So
it's a fascinating culture in itself.
Happened.
Yeah, it's a fascinating culture. I've always been immersed in it myself because I draw mandalas, which are actually a Indian form of artwork, which I think your partner is involved with as well. And so I've always been fascinated by it too. And I understand. I mean, there may be some part of me that is drawn to Indian astrology, sort of the Vedic approach, but I've just never been able to get into it. I know in many ways I've heard that say that it is far more accurate with regard to predictability, with regard to the transits, but I've always been satisfied with what I got from Western astrology. So it's curious to see how you sort of made that leap, and you know exactly when you sort of got that bug that says you're gonna, and you got consumed by this astrology and being pulled into it in this whole new language. I mean, it's there's something familiar about the basic foundational concepts of astrology that are there for you, but you got a whole new language, and in many cases the signs aren't precisely the same as they are in Western astrology, which has always been a thing of frustration for many Western astrologers trying to rationalize their Vedic astrology with Western astrology. How do you rationalize if you're a different sign? It just doesn't all seem to make sense.
It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. And, I think probably the way that I view it, because I still, again, because my heritage, my background is in Western astrology, and I think Western astrology is amazing, and I don't discount it at all. It's incredible. Each system is incredible in their own right. And if you take them and use them, so to answer your second question is if I'm looking at a Vedic astrology chart, I'm looking at, for me, because there are some tropical Vedic astrologers as well, right? But I use the sidereal system, which does, change the signs, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's not just about the sun sign. It's about all the planets in combination and how they're, playing within the birth chart. And so regardless of whether it's an Eastern or a Western chart, you're still going to have, and certainly the aspects are different, and I go through all of that in the book. And actually the thing I think that might be helpful for you, as you mentioned, this is complicated in the language, and it's like, I kind of wanted to do it, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I want to get that deep into it. I tried to write a book for someone who's coming from Western astrology because I understand the differences, and I've easily outlined, okay, so this is what's going to shift here. These are the differences there, right? And kept it in a very digestible format,
Okay.
so that somebody could dip their toe into Vedic astrology without having to go into the deep end of the pool, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I get it.
Right?
Makes sense. Yeah. No, you're just getting a taste for it, getting your appetite wet.
Yeah, and figure it out. And regardless of the system, if you have Sun, Saturn opposing in your chart, you're going to have it in your Vedic chart, and you're also going to have it in your Western chart. It's just going to happen in a different sign and potentially in a different house.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there are definitely some nuances where there will be some differences, but there are also some similarities that these themes will remain the same regardless of the system.
So when you say, like you mentioned that Saturn-Sun opposition, which is you have the same thing in Western versus Vedic. It does, the placement of the planets at the time is going to be the same. They just may be in a different sign. So you would look at, because, you know, the signs do take on, they color the reading of the relationship. They add a depth of some sort of color. Color is the only word I can think of right now, but they're colored in that regard. I don't mean physically colored, literally colored, but they have a sense of recognition between the two of them, that they know that there's this sort of inherent tension in the chart between the two planets, and how that planetary mix matches up. You know, if it's a Cancer Capricorn versus an Aries Libra sort of opposition, that would be different. And see, in the Western astrology, the Aries Libra opposition would bring up a level of, you know, there's be the opposition there, and there'd be a level of interpretation that was there. But that interpretation is colored by the signs that they're in. In Vedic astrology, they'd be in a different sign altogether, and that would change that whole interpretation, or would it not?
Absolutely. It would change it tremendously, because the strength of the planet, that's something that's really important with regard to Vedic astrology, is the strength. And I know Western astrology as well, even though there's some subtle nuances that the two systems have that are different, but the planetary strength is super important. So yeah, if you've got Saturn in Libra, right, where it's exalted, and Sun exalted in Aries in a Western chart, you know, versus Sun in Pisces in an Eastern chart versus Saturn in Virgo in the Eastern chart. That's a big shift.
Well, that's right? What raises the point. I mean, would there be, I mean, theoretically, I mean, if you think about astrology as a concept, theoretically, both interpretations of that planetary mix that we just talked about should theoretically come out the same, because it's the takeaway that the astrologer would bring to the table would be similar in some respects because of the nature of the planets, even though they were in different signs via different systems. So the concept, I think, would be that there would be this exchange, there would be this common link, even though the signs were not there. So in this case, I think that the signs might take on a different role between the two different systems. Do you follow me? In other words, I've always had this theory that if you took a Vedic astrologer, a Western astrologer, a Chinese astrologer, and say a Tibetan astrologer. Those are the four major astrology systems that I know. And of course, there's also the Aztec astrology system as well. If you took 5 of those people, put them all in the same room with the same chart, they should, theoretically, I emphasize that word, come out with roughly the same interpretation of the basic concepts and foundational characteristics of the individual. Is that right or not?
I agree with you 100%, although maybe not everyone.
But I agree with you 100%. But
they're not going to agree with me. But I do agree with you 100%, because I've used Western astrology and I've used Vedic astrology both, and I think they both work. And I think there is an element of, I don't know what the right word is, Chris. I want to maybe, I don't want to say magic. That's not the right word.
I mean,
there's another element, this element, right?
Well, there's a certain cohesion of ideas that it comes up through the. I think it depends more upon the placement of the planets than it does perhaps the signs, which would then say you always defer to the power of the planet versus the sign, because the sign is somewhat arbitrary based on the system you're using. Even if you use, whole house signs or Placidus or tropical, whatever interpretation system you use even within Western astrology, there's wide variations. But it does sort of push the topic to the power of the planet being the overarching theme, because that would remain the same. If you have an opposition in a chart, it's going to be the same regardless of the system you're using, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Now, they may be ruling different houses, and that will shift things potentially dramatically, but then who knows with the shift in the other planets that, I don't know how to say it. Whole systems have always worked for me.
Mm-hmm. But you come down with...
And I know that's not going to be a popular answer probably for people.
Well, no, that's okay. We're here just to discuss this. We're having rhetorical questions. We're just raising ideas and keeping a conversation going, because it's a stimulating topic, and it's interesting to me because I've always ascribed to that theory that regardless of the system you use, you should come away with a basic idea of who that person is. There should be a certain elemental quality. Now, of course, the devil's in the details, I suppose, and that's where you probably get in. And the more granular you become with the systems, and especially with the nakshatras, when that becomes a lot more granular, the dimensions of the moon, you get into these areas where you get far more detail than you might have gotten in other systems. So, and I think in that regard, Vedic astrology does provide a level that is far more complicated, complex, and perhaps more, what's the word I want? Forward-thinking, more predictable, more related around predictions than perhaps Western astrology is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the predictive methodology within the Vedic system, which includes the nakshatras, thank you for bringing that up, because yes, there's so much about the nakshatras. That's been kind of my area of focus for the last few years.
And that sort of takes the moon, that takes the individual signs and divides it even further, right? So you get a far more.
It does.
Mm-hmm. But what's that?
They're
27?
The signs into there's 27 or maybe 28 originally, but the most commonly used scheme is 27. They're 13 degrees and 20 minutes each of a sign. And they're really powerful because they're related to the moon, right? The nakshatra is a mansion of the moon. Actually, the moon is male in the Vedic system. All the planets are male, but the moon still conveys feminine energy and still is an indicator of mother, but it's still male. And he has 27 wives. They're all sisters.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
They are. Yep. And these are the mansions of the moon. These are the nakshatras. So each one of these mansions of the moon has a really powerful impact on our consciousness, because in Vedic astrology, the moon is equally as important as the sun is in Western astrology. And because it's the mind and our emotions and our intuition and our peace of mind. And these nakshatras, let me tell you, they're incredible. That's all I can say is, having worked with the nakshatras in birth charts and how they can pull a person's mind into a certain train of thought or way of being, like into dance or into music or, into healing. They're really powerful. Because
what you do is you find a planet in a nakshatra, and then you combine the planetary aspects or the planetary attributes and combine them with the attributes of the nakshatra, and you would get more granularity in that regard?
Exactly. The planetary attributes and the house that the planet rules itself, and what house exactly is that planet within that nakshatra. And then there are the planetary periods. There's the Vimshottari Dasha system, which is probably the most widely used, although there's a gazillion different dasha timing tools that are out there, but the Vimshottari dasha is the most widely used. And so that's the timing tool that you can get into that granular predictive element that you were talking about that activates certain planets within certain nakshatras.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you were running a planetary period of moon, then that's going to activate the 3 moon-ruled nakshatras in the birth chart.
I see.
And so depending on where those are in your birth chart, that gets lit up. And then depending on what those nakshatras represent and the deities that are associated with the nakshatra, that's one of the big keys, Chris, is the presiding deity of the nakshatra, to really understanding the keys. And there are people who have written incredible books on the nakshatras. Camilla Sutton
right,
and
I've
Dennis
interviewed her.
Harness. They have wonderful books. I did touch on the nakshatras in my book, but I had to focus on the deities because, again, there's so much. You could literally write volumes.
Yeah, no, I know. I've interviewed
if
Kamala before, and I've interviewed Ronnie Dreyer, is a other Vedic astrologer, and Joni Patri.
Yes.
Yeah, I know all of them. Yeah.
Yes. They're all wonderful, wonderful astrologers.
And they're all Western. They all started out as Western astrologers. Maybe not Kamala, but I know Ronnie did, and I know Joni did. Started out as regular Western astrologers, and then moved over to Vedic astrology, just as you have, when they discovered that there was so much more depth there with regard to what's the information that's provided.
Well, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's just there's maybe a little bit more, but it's just different in the sense because there's Hellenistic astrology, right? That's becoming pretty popular. Chris Brennan in his his book on Hellenistic astrology, I think, has really kind of brought to light a lot of the similarities of ancient Western astrology and then ancient Indian astrology and how I think, they started out pretty close to the same place.
Yeah,
but they just evolved differently through the culture, right?
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Yeah, because Western astrology became more psychologically oriented, and Vedic astrology or Jyotisha has been, it's evolved kind of through the religious and spiritual traditions of India, and where in the West that's become further and further apart because of what happened in the United States, right, with regard to our culture and the esoteric arts in general. Right?
Right, exactly.
Which you probably know more about than I do.
Well, I dabble in that, yes, right, yeah, for sure. But when you think of the way the charts are laid out and the information that's derived there, do you deal with transits? Do you deal with the passing planets as well as the static planets? I think of the
absolutely.
Yeah, so you have a static chart, which is when you're born, and then you have the transiting chart, which brings you to where you are today, and you sort of compare those two, and you can see where it is. And if you experienced in your own personal experience, looking at charts and seeing a sort of a difficult transit coming up, have you been able to see that happen? Do you think that's something that you can dodge if you know this ahead of time? If being forewarned is forearmed?
Great question. I love it. Dodge. Then you get into the question of karma with capital K, right?
Yeah, which is a very valid topic too.
Yeah, it's huge. Can you ever really dodge your karma? I think what you said, forewarned is forearmed.
Right.
I personally don't believe we can dodge our karma, but I do believe that it's how we choose to react to
that's a very good way of
life
putting
experiences.
it. Yeah, I like that way. Because there's always going to be tragedy in people's lives. There's always going to be hardship. There's always going to be joy. And I think, like I always say, being forewarned is being forearmed. By seeing a difficult transit come up, you may not experience it quite as radically or as dramatically as people may expect to see. And oftentimes there's a lot of drama that goes with astrology, and people get very wound up with the sky falling and everything else. But it's never really quite that dramatic. But the impact is there. You do feel the difficult times. You may not feel them all the time during the day. If you have a Jupiter, a Saturn Jupiter square or a Pluto Jupiter square, you might feel that in some way. You're going to feel, thwarted or maybe walking through mud. It's just not going to be as easy of a process. But, we sort of adapt with that in our daily lives because every day can be difficult and every day can have moments of difficulty and every day can have moments of ease. And it's a composite of all the above that makes our life. But we all have these periods of time where you'll go through a Saturn aspect of some sort, whether it be an opposition, a square, or a conjunction, can be very difficult just because that's the way Saturn is. That's just the nature of it. But ultimately, Saturn really is your friend, if you think about it, because if it didn't provide that difficulty or that hardship for you or that sort of coming to terms, you wouldn't have the ability to grow. So you have to have that sort of evolutionary task before you. That's part of what life is all about, I think. So.
Yeah, it's huge. And Saturn is super important. And as a matter of fact, there's a quote from a Western astrology book, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of it. So I apologize to the author, but it has stuck with me. And that is, I like to think of Saturn as protection through limitation.
Yep, I like that for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, because it just you just never know what you're being protected from. We don't always get what we want, but we always get what we need when it comes to Saturn, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's it gets a bad rap in the world of astrology, but I think it's a viable tool. I do think that the hardship is there, and the hardship is there for a reason. I mean, it's the way I always think of it is if there's a square in the chart, that's the equivalent of climbing stairs because it's a 90-degree angle. And when you're climbing stairs, you're working to make your life better, and you're facing hardships. You're pushing the rock up the hill, and the rock is rolling back down on you sometimes. And so you have to have that. You have to have that sort of tension. It's how we evolve and grow. We grow through experience and trial, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the value of astrology, at least for me, and this is the perspective that I work from with my clients, and I have, if people ask me a question, I have to be candid with them with regard to what I see. And, if I see the potential for a difficult period coming up, I will tell them. But, the good news is usually it doesn't last very long, right?
And it's not usually as hard as it sounds. People can tend to they inflate these sort of things because they think of there's a certain magic that goes to astrology. I will grant you that, and I agree with you. And because of that magic, people think, oh my gosh, it's going to be the worst. Why? I don't know why people tend to go to the worst automatically, but they do. It's kind of funny. I'm not sure what that says about humans, but automatically when they hear of a difficult time coming or a tough aspect, they automatically think, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? I'm going to hide and stay in my house all day because it's got a bad aspect. But that doesn't mean you have to do that. You may have an interesting time, but this is what builds character, and this is how we evolve.
Right. And I think it's natural to have fear and anxiety. I've worked with a lot of clients who've, unfortunately had a bad experience with astrology and really had a lot of fear created.
Well, that's the chore of the astrologer to sort of avoid that. Right?
Yeah, definitely don't want to do that.
We're not here to scare people. We're here to help people find the gold in their chart, the silver in their chart.
Exactly. What are your gifts, and what are when can you take advantage of, the old saying is, make hay while the sun shines.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So when is a good time so that you can take advantage, and when is it a good time not to try to do something, some potentially, right?
And I think if people look back at their lives not knowing astrology, they would see the times that they excelled and the times that they held back or didn't hold back would align with something that was going on with their charts. That's obvious. I mean, that's very clear, I think.
100%. I 100% agree with you.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating subject, and that the comparison of the two is really something really interesting. We're talking today with Pamela McDonough. She's the author of a new book called Vedic Astrology for Beginners, An Introduction to the Origins and the Core Concepts of Jyotish. Pamela McDonough. Her website is moondanceastrology.com. I encourage you to check out that book. The book is now available on Amazon. You can see what that's all about if you're curious. And I think it's good. I think you serve a very valuable purpose here because many people are afraid or reluctant to put their toes into the into the Vedic astrology pool because they're not sure what they're going to come out with. And so it's important to have this. I think having it for beginners is a very critical piece. We'll take a quick break here, and we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes. In the meantime, check out her website, moondanceastrology.com. And she is the author of Vedic Astrology for Beginners, an introduction to the origins and core concepts of Jyotish. We'll be right back. Hang in.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flischer, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflischer.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflischer.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flischer, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Pamela McDonough, and she has just written a book called Vedic Astrology for Beginners, an introduction to the origins and core concepts of Jyotish. Now, those of you who listen to this show are astrology fans and astrologers, hopefully. I'm sure you are. And I talk all the time with astrologers all the time about concepts of astrology and how it works and sort of the mysteries of the universe. I'm fascinated by all these things. I got all this 8th house material in my personal chart. So it's a fascination for me to delve into these topics, and I think it's interesting. I've dabbled in Jyotish astrology before, Vedic astrology, and I even got pretty far, but I never got far enough to say I could call myself a Vedic astrologer. I'm fascinated by it, and I'm curious as to how you come to, this is probably the biggest question between the two forms of astrology, say Western and Vedic, is how do we accommodate for the precession of the equinoxes? And this has always bothered me because the one side of me says, wow, the precession of the equinoxes is totally logical on a scientific level. It does make sense. The Earth is on a wobble. It does change. The signs are changing. And that, to me, is a fascinating concept because, on one hand, I know that it's a natural, universal, cosmic experience, event, and yet we are stuck in this rigid form of astrology where this is only these dates to this date is one sign. And how do we rationalize that? Have you had that conversation with yourself? Have you wrestled with that whole problem?
I have, and so have a lot of other people, which you may be aware of. There was some really wonderful scholars that put forth arguments on both sides for that actually were Vedic astrologers, not necessarily Western astrologers.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because, as I mentioned earlier, there are some Vedic astrologers who use the tropical zodiac. And I have to be honest, Chris, I am not, like, at the heart of who I am is a reader.
Right.
Truly. I mean, that is the heart of who I am. And I have listened to all of the arguments, and I will use that word intentionally, all of the arguments. And all I can say is when I practice Western astrology with the tropical zodiac, but I don't, let me rephrase that, sorry. When I use Western astrology with tropical zodiac, because I don't practice Western astrology, but I will look at it sometimes just because, again, that's my heritage.
Yep.
But when I practice Vedic astrology, I practice it traditionally with the sidereal zodiac, and that works for me. The tropical zodiac works for me with Western astrology. The Vedic system works for me with sidereal. And I just can't, I don't know what to say, because I've heard arguments for both.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I don't know. This is where I have this big. It's a big area.
You asked me the $1 million question, Chris.
I know, and I don't have an answer for it. And I've asked this of other Vedic astrologers as well, and because it doesn't seem like it jives. You know, if you have a scientific mind or are used to, anybody who studies astrology has to have some sort of science or math going on in their head, because you got to deal with all these degrees and angles, and you got to be able to find that. Yep. So if you have that kind of a mind, which most astrologers, all astrologers do, you would come up with this. You'd see the disparity here. You'd say, well, there's this precession of the equinoxes, and it changes the way the signs are, and then you say, okay, well, I'm not an Aries, I must be a Pisces, and if I'm a Pisces, that means I'm a much different person than an Aries, because they really are night and day in some regard, different polarities, different everything, different elements, and then you say, well, how do I justify this? How do I rationalize that? And then you have to find a way to make that conversation cohesive so that it works for both, and that's where I've always had trouble, because, well, what happens, I think, is that people, if they realize that they are an Aries in Western astrology, but they're a Pisces in Vedic astrology, they may take the Vedic astrology of the Pisces and apply it to the Western. So they might use a Western interpretation of what a Pisces is versus an Aries, and of course they're going to come up differently. But what I'm wondering is that, does the person who is in that gray area between being a Vedic or being a Western astrology sign, there must be something in that difference of those two things, that just the language, that has something that is common, because the person is born at that time, and they're looking at themselves through two different sets of lenses, so for metaphorically speaking, and those lenses are different because they're through a different interpretation. It's just like speaking Spanish or speaking German. You may be saying the same thing, but they're being told in different languages. Is it the same knowledge that comes out of it? I think that your answer probably is that yes, it is the same answer.
For me personally, and again, it's such a sensitive. You hit such a sensitive topic.
I had to.
Yeah, right. And to be honest, my teacher, who is my primary teacher, who is Indian from India, who is brilliant. He's brilliant, and he could give you a very clear answer about why the sidereal system would be the correct system to practice Vedic astrology. I am not as learned in astronomy and, the precession of the equinox and basically culturally, right, how he has at the age of, I think, 8 is when he first started studying astrology.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. And I don't have that background and that perspective that he has.
Mm-hmm.
But I guarantee you, if you were speaking to an Indian astrologer, like I said, someone like my teacher, or even other Westerners who practice Indian astrology, they would have a very different answer than I'm giving you. Right?
I wonder. That's what I'm wondering if there would be a difference in it. I mean, it might be just nuance in the way it's presented, but there would be, because a lot of it's based on the planets, just the planets themselves. I mean, the planets are not going to change their position in the sky based on, because you're going from Western to Vedic, you're still going to have the same placements because you're born at that point in time, which gives you that imbues you with that character. But I'm wondering if a person, born, in Western astrology is one sign, and in Vedic astrology is another sign. So there is an area, and just for people who know this, that there is an area where, if let's go back to the example I used before of Aries. If you're an Aries and you're born in the, in the early degrees, or the first, 10 degrees or 12 degrees of, maybe more, maybe 15 degrees of Aries, that would push you into a different sign via the Vedic astrology. So I think I saw it.
Yeah, it's like the first 24 degrees.
23,
right now,
yeah, because that makes
24.
sense. Yeah, it's 24 degrees, right? Because that would that aligns with the whole precession of the equinox, because that's a 23-point-something degree angle. I think that is
and
off.
Change.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So an Aries, in Western astrology is March 20th, so say to April 20th. In Vedic astrology, it's April 13th through May 14th. So that changes that person differently. So that person who is that middle of the road sort of Aries is now going to be someone born between March 13th and April 12th. And when you do a sort of a overview of what that person is, and you can do this because you have the ability to see both sides of the coin, how do you come up with a common sort of interpretation for that person who is in Western astrology in Aries, but in Vedic astrology is a Pisces? Because I think it's hard to distinguish. I mean, they really are different signs. One's water, one's fire in Western astrology. That's where
they
things
are different.
Yeah, that's where things fall
and
apart.
See, I think it's because it's the whole chart. It's not, again.
It's not the date so much.
Western astrology has always been so sun sign focused.
Yep.
And to me, it's the entire birth chart. So let's say you shift from Aries to Pisces, but maybe your Pisces. So you become Pisces rising, so the chart ruler becomes Jupiter, again, in the traditional scheme, not using Neptune or Pluto or Uranus as house rulers. Then maybe Jupiter is in Sagittarius in Vedic astrology instead of Scorpio. So that would make the person have a fire quality or a fire element, right, to their personality that would come in another way rather than just from the rising sign or from the sun sign. And all of that, falls into, have you heard of the term dosha?
Yes.
In Ayurvedic? Okay. So dosha being a person's constitution, whether you're primarily fire, water, air, right?
Yeah.
And I have to say that, reading for people from the Vedic perspective and looking at the birth chart and understanding enough about Ayurveda to read for someone who I've never seen, because I just do my readings over the phone generally. Right. Most of my clients are not where I live. And to be able to determine a person's dosha from their birth chart strictly without, anything else, that tells me that the combination of planets and the system that I'm using is correct, because I can tell if a person is a Pitta person or who's fiery, or a Vata person who, is more airy, and those folks usually get hit in the digestive tract, right? And or if they're more Jala or water-based person. So I don't know. I think you're asking the $1 million question.
I know.
All
I'm not.
know
I'm
is
not
that
trying to put you on the spot. I'm just trying. to. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. It's an awkward. It's an unusual conundrum that I have had this conversation with many times
it
with Vedic
is.
astrologers, and it's like, so if somebody is born in Aries and they are a fire sign in Western astrology, but they've got, I don't know, they got Mars in Scorpio, Venus in Pisces, Moon and in Cancer, say. Those are all water-based signs. Then what would you read their dosha as? I mean, you'd have to go see it.
It would depend on their rising sign. Rising sign is huge, right? Because the first house is the physical body, and then where is the chart ruler, and how is the chart ruler aspected?
Yeah, all those are. Yeah,
and
that's you can do that regardless of the system, right? You can get that both systems.
Exactly. And so again, that's why I kind of, I think the sun sign is important, the moon sign is important, the rising sign is important. They're all very important, but it is that combination of the entire birth chart that creates the person ultimately, right? The whole of the person. And so, I think that's the big difference, because there is such an emphasis, right, on the sun sign in Western astrology.
Yeah, I think the reason that became that way.
And the stereotype.
Yeah, I think the reason it became popular in Western astrology is because once they figured out a way to do sun sign astrology for popular magazines, that's when it really took off, I think. And that happened around 1939, I think, when somebody first started writing about people based on their sun sign. And doing that whole process of having the sign on the ascendant at 0 degrees and then seeing where all the action is, I think people sort of saw that as working, and they became enamored with that.
Absolutely. I mean, because it's such a complicated subject, right? As you said earlier, how do you possibly break this down so that you can give somebody something of value, right? That can relate to them. And I think a lot of archetypes and stereotypes have been ingrained with regard to some of the sun signs. But if you look on my website, Chris, I have for people who don't know their rising sign, I have the Vedic sun sign dates on my website, because how else is somebody going to read their horoscope if they don't know their rising sign in Vedic? I had to do it myself. And even though I say in bold letters on my website, if you know your rising sign, read for your rising sign. Otherwise, here's your sun sign.
Right.
You know? Because how is he going to do it, right? How is he going to offer people, how do you do it?
How do I do? I always base it on I use the sun sign. But I also use the ascendant. And the ascendant is what orients the whole chart. So that's where all your orientation comes from. When someone contacts me, I say you've got to have the birth time, at least within reason, because that really is what all the orientation comes. That sets the house. That sets the houses in order. Without that, it doesn't really pan out. But I think we were talking about Saturn earlier. Every 7 years we're going to get a hit from Saturn somewhere, at least in that neighborhood. And people who have a heavy Saturn in their chart may feel that more frequently. I have a heavy Saturn in my chart. It's in my first house. It's in Libra. And I do feel the 7-year cycles very powerfully. I mean, I can look back through my life, and almost everything that of any consequence happened to me in and around a 7-year of my life, whether it was 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, all the way up. And always has been there as a very resoundingly accurate method. I don't necessarily put my feet in the floor to break myself for when these times are coming, but I can see them coming. And it's not always dramatic. They oftentimes are times of growth, and I think that's important. That would be the same, regardless of it was Western or Vedic. You would still go through those same things, and I wonder if those would be highlighted the same way. Do you look for those 7-year cycles when you're doing a Vedic chart? Would you see that influence of Saturn, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of nuances even. So depending on how close is Saturn to your rising degree, Chris?
Well, it's about 30 degrees away. It's in my first house, though. No, it's at 22,
Okay.
22 degrees. Let me see, 8, about 19 degrees away, 20 degrees away, yeah, roughly.
19. Okay, so you're probably in this. So so sorry, I'm converting in my head.
You're right. That's what I'm
Thank
wondering.
you. So I just want to make sure, like, Saturn is still in your first house in your Vedic chart. So some of the nuances might be this. Yes, the 7.5 year cycles are important. One of them is a period called Sati Sati.
Mm-hmm.
That's a 7.5 year period. You probably heard of it, right? Where Saturn goes into the whole house before the moon, the house of the moon, the house after the moon. And that is a period that, is often depicted as emotionally challenging, right? Because it's your moon, it's your mind and your emotions. Mm-hmm. But there is no way that whole 7.5 year period is going to be tough.
No, of course not.
It just doesn't happen.
Right, no, it doesn't happen.
Right?
No, I agree with you there. It's always triggered by something. But typically, even if you look at anybody without even using astrology, you look at the stages of development in a person. At 7 years old, a child is beginning to get their social skills together. They're beginning to gain their confidence. They're beginning to know who they are or not. Same thing happens at 14. People are entering puberty or whatever. 21, you're sort of in the whole new realm. All those dates, all the way around the wheel, are significant for people who have who are growing up and going through their natural cycles of what life's all about. So it's very normal to see that. And that would happen in both systems.
With the Saturn return, right? 28 to 30. Mm-hmm. Right? And then another difference is at age 36, for people who have Saturn prominent in their chart like you do, all the planets have a maturation date, and Saturn is the planet that matures at age 36. Mm-hmm. You may have had something significant occur in your life at age 36.
I sure did.
And so it may have been related to relationship. It may have been related to your children. Because
those are all natural. I mean, that would apply to almost everybody. People who are following a typical, sort of path of evolution and personal growth would, that's why people get married. They graduate college, they get married, they buy houses at 28, and they have babies at 35 or whatever. That's sort of a natural kind of a layer. And that doesn't make it, obviously having babies makes your life more difficult. There's no question about it. But it's not a bad hardship. It's a good hardship because it's something that you're creating something that you love. You're creating a child that wasn't there before. So,
yeah, absolutely. And everybody, but see, for you specifically, Saturn, because you'd be Virgo rising, I think, in the Vedic system, and Saturn rules your 5th house. So something maturing as it relates to Saturn would specifically be children for you. It may be something different for someone else.
Oh, I agree.
Someone who has Saturn that rules their 7th house, mm-hmm. that may be when they marry.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So it's depending. It really is dependent on the chart, that mm-hmm. the maturation date of the planet and how it unfolds in an individual's life is actually unique to the person. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can
nuance.
See that. So let's ask him. Let's drill down into your book a little bit so people get the idea what's going on. So in your book, you have sort of you've acknowledged the fact that there are differences between Western and Vedic astrology, and then you go on to sort of introduce people to the various the terminology, the mentions of the moon, as you mentioned, the nakshatras, and all the other characteristics that make up that. And then do you apply a sense of meaning to those so people can then learn what these mean and where their things are? You can't, in other words, you don't provide enough information that makes it dangerous for people to go in and read this book. If they start peeling away their charts and saying, oh my gosh, my moon is in my, whatever nakshatra, I got Mars here, what's this going to mean? This is a way of methodology of introducing, say, a Western astrology to Vedic astrology, or is it just a approach of understanding Vedic astrology as it is, because it is such a complex place? You've got to go someplace with it.
Yep, that's a beautiful question, and it is both. It actually is a good place for someone who's coming from Western astrology who kind of wants to just check it out and maybe see what it's all about, and mm-hmm. without having to right out of the gate learn Sanskrit, because that's usually right. If you start studying intensely with a teacher or on your own, but generally it's with a teacher. That's another difference in the system, is that it's a spoken tradition. The tradition of Jyotisha is handed down through the spoken word, although certainly in more modern times, right, there's a lot more written material than there ever has been. But the book itself is really the basics of the background of the system, kind of where it comes from.
The language.
And then, the language a little bit, and there certainly is some Sanskrit terminology in there to get people kind of familiar with, the differences. Like, for example, the word planet in Sanskrit is graha. And graha does not translate as the English word planet. It literally means to grasp or to seize. Huh. There is no word planet, right? That's used in it's graha and drishti. So drishti is the term that would be used in Western astrology. Aspect would be used, but drishti means to gaze, and so it's really about this more I don't know what the word is, dynamic.
Well, it's more of an intellectual sort of exercise. What was the word you used again to describe the graha? You said
you mean planet?
Yeah.
Or are you
what does graha mean? What does graha mean?
To grasp.
To grasp. Yeah, I like that, because that's sort of understanding. I mean, you can't touch grasp. You have to be able to understand it. So that's where I say it's more of an intellectual conversation. You've got to be able to understand that, how that theme works in a person. In order
because the planetary energy grasps us and seizes us, right? Rather than
it's sort of a guide. It's
planet,
sort of
more.
Yeah, it's an energy guide of sorts that is guiding us on our way. It's sort of a map of our potential. That's what all astrology is, as far as I can see.
Exactly right. So there are some differences, and some of those fundamental differences I talk about in the book, but I don't get into anything in too much detail. To be honest, I get into it enough so that people can kind of look at it and go, okay, if you are a Western astrologer, you can see, okay, the meaning of this house is slightly different from the Western astrology interpretation of, XYZ house. And the planet has a little different meaning, and certainly all of the, the fundamental myths and stories, right, exactly. are different between the the Indian tradition versus the Western.
I've always thought of astrology as a collection of stories. I've always said that astrology really is a collection of stories, whereby the story could go any different way you want it to go, but ultimately at the end of the day, the theme would be the same. A story is a person, place, and a thing, and a character going through a certain event of some sort. That will be a story, a sort of a journey, a story, a little vignette of something, and that could be because the world we live in, a dualistic world. You could go either way with that story. That's the truth, and that's the secret. It's more about teasing out that theme. What's the theme? What's the overarching theme that's associated with these planets in this particular aspect? There's got to be, if you've got a Venus, if you've got a Uranus Moon conjunction, that's going to have a certain theme to it, a certain flavor to it. It's going to have a certain, it's going to be a little eccentric. It's going to be a little bit emotional. It's going to be all the things, the attributes that we ascribe to the planets. But that theme, it can go the other way too. That's always the way I see it, astrology. It's always the potential is there to go either way. When we're apprised of what we're going through, it's how we manifest and how we have free will to act on that potential that drives the success or the, I think that's how you can use astrology in that regard. If you see this potential coming, there's this potential in your chart as an individual, you've got certain attributes, you've got certain qualities, and then that theme comes up, and you have the choice of acting on it or just sitting back and watching it go. And I think that's the secret that's where free will enters into the astrology. And if you work with that in astrology, working with the free will and the potential, you can arrive where you want to arrive, but that is free will. Don't you think that's something right about that?
That's a really important point because, you know, we talked about Saturn, right, a little bit. But you know what? People with strong Jupiters, I don't care what planet you're talking about. It doesn't matter whether it's Jupiter,
Right.
Venus, Mars, Saturn, whatever. You know, people who have a strong Jupiter, that can manifest in challenging ways in a person's life, right?
Of course,
because,
yeah.
you know, I call it bright, shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, well, I always think
You know?
of Jupiter as the great amplifier. So it can be amplifying what's good or amplifying what's bad, but it does amplify. It brings a sense of
Exactly.
largesse to you, you know. It brings,
Yeah.
mhm.
Exactly. It's not always, you know, something that
It's not a black and white
is-
thing where Jupiter is great and Saturn is bad. It's never that way. It's never that way. More for any planet.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. And it's what you said, you know, it's what you said. It's how do you want to work with the energy, right? And it's an awareness. And once you become aware of something, then you have the choice to, you know, let the planetary energy work through you in a way that is, you know, positive and beneficial or not. And, you know, it's funny because my teacher always says, you know, if you get somebody in front of you and you read their chart, and assuming that you have the, you know, the right birth time, et cetera, and the chart doesn't fit them at all, that's
Something's right.
beautiful.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well,
No, it's actually beautiful because they have completely transcended, right? Like, you know, like let's say the Dalai Lama sat in front of you. Hopefully, right, we wouldn't be able to read his chart because he's transcended the grasp, right, of the grahas, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I get that. I can see that.
Yeah.
I mean, it does make sense. Yeah.
you see what I'm?
Yep. But
see
that
where I'm going
requires
with
that
that?
requires
Yeah.
that requires work.
Oh yeah, lifetimes and lifetimes of work. I would think, right?
Yeah.
I know I'm not there. I'm still working on it, Chris. I am.
Yeah. No, we all are.
Every day.
I'm trying.
Even right,
Yeah.
every day I work on my stuff. I am in no way immune to the
Oh, no, I
transits
don't think anybody
and
is.
the
Yeah.
grasp of the grahas.
They're all a work in process. Anyway, you know, I can't believe how fast the time has gone by. I'll have to have you back on again sometime to talk about this in greater depth. But we have kind of run out of time, unfortunately. But this is an interesting subject. I think it's worthy of all of us to sort of delve into. Even if you have cursory curiosity about it, it really has the potential to sort of unlock the mysteries of neo-astrology. There's no question about it. It is a complicated thing, but I think, you know, you shouldn't be put off by the language. And I think if you're having an introductory book, really helps quite a bit. So Pamela, thank you so much for coming on today. My guest has been Pamela McDonough. She's the author of a new book called Vedic Astrology for Beginners, which sounds like it's one of those Vedic astrology for dummies, but we know it's not that. It's more of the idea of, you know, how do we understand this other language? How can we make sense of it? And what is it that is important about it that brings us to, you know, where do we get, you know, how do we rationalize the two systems? And can we gain insight from all forms of astrology? I think we probably can. It really probably comes down to, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But it's interesting to see that you've been so consumed by Vedic astrology that is now your preferred method.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and we'll have to do it again because this did go by very quickly. I know we got on a tangent, but you know,
it flew.
It's one of those things that you can't. You know, I think it's okay because this really is. It's a necessary conversation. I think, to be honest, because there is so much value there. There is so much education. There is so much learning to be brought to the table by this method that we'd be crazy not to delve into it and at least exercise what we can get from it. You know, it's just be crazy not to have it.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
I agree.
I apologize the time went by so fast, and I hope we didn't stray too far. I hope we touched on things you wanted to touch on, but I have this mind that goes, and I just have all these questions that come to my mind, so that's where we are. But we'll get you back on again.
No,
we'll do it again.
Are
Anyway,
we still recording?
Yeah. Anyway, so moondanceastrology.com. Moondanceastrology.com is the name of Pamela McDonough's website. She's a Vedic astrology. She's just written Vedic Astrology for Beginners, which is for the beginner, which is really a fascinating discussion of, you know, an introduction to the origins and core concepts of Jyotish, which is the Vedic astrology core. And it's fascinating because if you're interested in astrology at all, you've got to be curious about Vedic astrology because it really is quite revealing. Anyway, Pamela, thank you so much for coming on today. My guest today is Pamela McDonough, author of Vedic Astrology for Beginners. So thank you so much for coming on today, Pamela.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Fleischer. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.